I think engineers need to communicate better and think more clearly and take responsibility for the world that our work creates. We use this term soft skills a lot, which I hate, because I don't think that is a soft skill, right? I think that's your job, literally your job.
Hey, welcome, Charles. Great to have you here. Wanted to really start by asking you about professional skills for software engineers. You've written a series of shortcuts, I think it's called, that rely on this. What are they?
Yeah, so as you said, that's a series of shortcut articles. It's kind of the boring answer. I had the idea for a long time, and it was kind of one of those things that was nascent and not very well thought through. I think there were, I'm going to say, sort of three parts to the rough process. So the first was kind of looking over my own career and whatever success I've had that wasn't, purely down to luck. I think a lot of anyone's success really is luck, but the bits that weren't purely luck also weren't due to my programming ability. Right? It was mostly down to other things, like being able to talk to executives and do presentations and understanding systems thinking and critical thinking and communication patterns and so on. And the sort of dawning realization I had was that that's all stuff you can learn. Like, you're not necessarily going to be the next Jeanette Winston and write beautiful prose, but you can absolutely learn how to communicate factual information clearly and think critically and synthesize information. So that was kind of one part of the thought process. And then the second thing was I did a talk, I did it originally at DevOps UK, about writing as an engineer. So not writing for engineers, but being an engineer who writes. And I kind of imagined when they said they wanted me to do it, I kind of imagined I'd have, like 5 people in the room, or maybe be talking to a camera on my own or something. And then as it turned out, the room was pretty full. And I thought, well, that's interesting. There's clearly something here that people are curious about. But then I think the third thing was I'm, a child of the 1970s and 1980s. I learned to program in the 1980s mainly on, 8-bit computers, things like the Commodore 64. And it was interesting. I mean, the Commodore 64 was interesting because the machine was small enough that you could understand it kind of completely. So you could learn every chip, every buffer, everything. Right. And you could do fun things with it. Like you could store compressed code in the tape buffer, for example, and then explode it into main memory, which meant you could have a more than 64K of program running on a 64K machine. Things like that. It's kind of fun. And the reason I knew that was because there were people who wrote magazine articles with actual listings you could type in and explanations as to how they worked. And that's kind of how I imagined the industry would be when I joined it. I had a bit of a diversion. I went off and studied English literature at university rather than computer science, which I did, mostly to annoy an English teacher who told me I shouldn't. And then I gradually worked my way into professional software engineering. And one thing I found surprising was that code had become this kind of weird secret thing that we didn't talk about, we didn't explain. And, open source has helped with that. But I think as an industry, we also need to get much better at explaining what we do and why we do it. I think we tend to think that communication isn't for us or that it's not important. And I think increasingly, our work is having a massive impact and we're bad at explaining it. So it's that combination, the talk, the career reflection, growing up in the 1980s, I think, led me to this kind of very half-formed idea that, someone ought to do a book about things that aren't programming but might be helpful if you're a programmer. And I pitched it to O'Reilly, and they said, we don't think this is a book. Fair enough. But then they said, but we do think there's something here, which is wonderful. Because one of the things with an idea, I think with any idea actually, is they're quite fragile things when you first articulate them. Like an idea is very easily squished. And rather than squishing it, the editor at O'Reilly helped me develop the structure and help me clarify my own thinking. And it was a wonderful process. And so we ended up with this idea of doing basically 14 shortcut articles. So these are kind of like connected short articles grouped into topical areas. So we have one on communication, one set on communication, one set on critical thinking, one set on documentation, one set on networking. So you can think of each group as being essentially a chapter. And then within each chapter, there are 3 or 4 articles with about 1,500 words each. So that's kind of how it came together.
Cool. So I remember those magazines going through the listings. That's how I learned to program too. And it was great fun. A lot of them were, for me, was simple computer games that you could write on a BBC Micro. Or I had the ZX Spectrum. I didn't get to Commodore until the Amiga.
Okay, yes. So I borrowed a ZX Spectrum one summer. A friend of mine had one, and he lent it to me for like a whole 6 weeks on holiday. So I did program the Spectrum a bit, but the Commodore 64 was the machine I bought, or my parents bought for me, strictly speaking. And and I also had, you probably did as well, BUK at that time. Most schools had a couple of BBC Micros kicking around, so I also programmed the BBC Micro a bit.
Yeah, people these days don't remember the fun of those floppy disks.
Yeah, or tape.
Or tapes, yeah.
But before we learned how to do compression, the tape loader on the Commodore 64, loading 64K of game took about, I'm going to say 20, 25 minutes. So you kick it off and go and ride your bike for half an hour and then come back. And either the game had loaded or it had failed partway through and you'd have to do it again.
Yep. I remember those days on the Spectrum.
It was not instant gratification.
No, not at all. So bringing back to communication, I really want to pull at that thread from the shortcuts, because I think that communication, once you get past, say, a high mid-level, is so important as a software engineer. You start having to deal with stakeholders, you start to deal with people in other parts of the business, you start mentoring and coaching people. All important things to kind of make it to senior and beyond. Also important for writing documentation and those other things that we're not known for. I think that a lot of these skills are becoming even more important now as AI is affecting the industry. We were talking a little bit about that before, so can I pull you back to the conversation we had before we started about where the industry is going with AI? And do you now think that these professional skills are even more important?
I do think they're even more important. It's interesting. I did an article very recently for Lead Dev, which has the slightly provocative title of "No One Knows What Programming Will Look Like in 2 Years," and it was interesting to write because it's quite personal. A lot of the articles that I write that are published aren't particularly personal articles. That one actually kind of is, and I was very pleased that Lead Dev took it. It wasn't guaranteed. So the first thing that is, so it came out. I got quite a reaction. If my social media is anything to go by, anyway, it does seem to have hit a bit of a nerve. Some people are, rather more defensive about that than other people. As is the nature of social media. And the other thing is, I do a little bit of lecturing at university on AI and on IT and sustainability, and I also mentor quite a few programmers at various levels. And in the last year or so, I've been asked quite a few times, "Is it time to leave the industry entirely?" And I've not been asked that for the previous 30 years or so that I've worked here. So there were a couple of things. I was lucky enough to talk at YAL Australia at the back end of last year, and Kent Beck gave a keynote which helped shape my thinking. Kent Beck has a model of product development, which is what he calls the 3X model. It's explore, expand, extract. It's a bit like the Settlers Town Planners Simon Wardley model, if you know that one. And basically, people have a natural home in one of those three phases. And programming, he would argue, has been in extract for decades. He would say since Smalltalk 80, more or less. And then the genie comes along. So the genie is Kent's rather lovely name for generative AI. He calls it the genie because it grants you your wishes, but it's not necessarily what you actually wanted. Which I think is a wonderful analogy. But anyway, so as a result of that, programmers who spent decades feeling comfortable in extraction have suddenly been abruptly dropped into exploration, which is a lot messier and a lot less certain and feels kind of alien. So I think a lot of us are feeling that. And I think, the core argument in the article is essentially that nobody, including Beck, knows what programming will look like. AI tools are genuinely quite good at the exploratory phases, getting from an idea to working code cheaply and quickly. They're less good at expansion and extraction, where mistakes are subtle and can be hard to catch. And there's a validation problem there. I think that's unsolved at this point, right? I do think we have to all get to grips with the new tools. I don't think they're going away. But what I also think is, rather than panicking or uncritically embracing the new tools, I think we need to focus on the skills that remain durable. And interestingly enough, I think those are the same. So understanding what a computer does, reading code critically, testing, validation, domain knowledge, system design, debugging, the so-called soft skills, although I hate that term of a passion of 1,000 burning suns, but, communication, critical thinking, documentation, those things matter as much or more than they ever did. So I interviewed my mother-in-law for this article, the wonderful Leslie Finney, who worked on punch card systems in Kenya in the 1960s. And the reason I interviewed her was because I was trying to think the last time our industry went through a transition like this. And it seems to me that punch cards to keyboards and screens is kind of a similar thing. And I think that the people who made that transition well weren't the people who pivoted quickly, but they were the people who took the time to figure out what actually mattered. So I don't think it's unreasonable to feel uncertain right now. I think we all do. And I think that's a sign of that you're actually paying attention. And I think actually paying attention, I think your attention at the end is one of the most important things of all.
It's interesting. I think I feel fairly certain about some things. And I'm fairly confident software engineering is not going away. I'm fairly confident there will be software engineers for many decades yet. My belief is that software engineering will go back to more what it was when I started it professionally. In some respects, I don't think it has changed. In other respects, I see people saying coding is dead, AI agents can write the code, software engineering is therefore dead. And I look at that and say, well, software engineering, writing the code was a tiny bit of it. My software engineering that I've been involved in has involved talking to a customer or stakeholder and figuring out what they want, figuring out should we build it, figuring out what problem we're solving and decomposing that. And there's been a whole load of thinking and communication and those soft skills that you mentioned before I started building a system. Even in Agile, there was still some level of that because we didn't just rush to code something. There was still a, well, what are we building? Why are we building it? What does good look like? And, okay, on a smaller scale doing that, but even then, back to, I think it was a pragmatic program, the idea of a walking skeleton. It'll be kind of, what's the minimum thing we can build and how do we do that? So coding, to my mind, has always been a very small part of software engineering.
Oh, 100%. And I would go even further and say, we spent decades trying to measure engineering productivity. And the one thing that we've learned is that lines of code is not a good measure of productivity, or GitHub commits, or bugs fixed, or any of those things. And it's because typing was never the hard bit, right? It never was. Knowing what to build is the hard bit. Building it, there are bits of building it that are hard. And interestingly enough, those bits are the interesting bits and also the bits that AI doesn't really do for you, because AI isn't good at structure. It's good at following instructions. So I think what you're actually looking at is a higher level of abstraction from a tooling perspective. And building levels of abstraction is literally what we do as an industry. I don't think typing was ever that important. Like, I was never promoted because of my typing speed.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
So I think we're in kind of broad agreement. I do think it's a big change. I mean, I think it's emotionally a big change for people.
Yes.
I'm involved with something called AI for the Rest of Us, which is it's a whole bunch of things, but it's a series of meetups and a conference and a newsletter. And I was at the London conference this year. It's the second year they've run it. And it's as the name implies, it's a kind of AI for non-AI people event. And because of that, you have not just programmers, but you have people from all kinds of different industries. And I talked to people at that event who were using words that were like grieving language. I am grieving for the fact that my skills are being taken away from me. And I completely get that. I mean, I've got a bunch of keyboards to my right there. I am a composer and a musician, not a terribly successful one, it has to be said, but nevertheless, it's a thing I love to do. I've done a couple of albums. I'm currently co-writing a third one. And, I could just as easily stick a prompt into something and get something that looks like or sounds like music to some people. It doesn't sound like music to me, but I completely understand it does to some people. And that's a tough, like if you've built your career as a media composer and suddenly you're not getting calls anymore because the producer's just prompting an AI to do it, that's hard, right? We shouldn't blind ourselves to the fact this is a tough transition. It really is. But I think for us as an industry, I think the idea that programming goes away is just nonsense. And in fact, I would draw a bit of a parallel to one of the projects I did. Gosh, I'm trying to remember when it was. Late 1990s, I think. I was working for an investment bank in London, and they had a management information department within HR. So there were lots of questions that would come in, like, I don't know, how many traders do we have in Latin America or something? And the job of this department was to produce those reports. And they were quite an expensive team. And at some point, and they were always late with everything. We were always behind because, there were far more requests than we could process. And at some point, we had this idea of maybe we could build a tool and then our customers could write their own reports and we wouldn't have to do that anymore. And that sounds like quite a good thing. And we built basically an abstraction there on top of the databases. It's all very drag and droppy, and you could, pull things that said something like salary in pounds sterling, and it would do all the SQL behind the scenes, right? We thought this was brilliant and everyone would love it. What actually happened was everyone turned around and went, well, that's not my job, that's your job. So I think the idea that, I'm not saying there won't be more people producing programs than there were in the past, in the same way that, like, when Microsoft Access was a thing, more people made databases for their departments than did before Microsoft Access was a thing. I think that still happens, right? But I think the idea that suddenly there are no programmers is just nonsense. And I would also say, while we're on the subject, because this is another LinkedIn narrative that really irritates me, we don't need junior programmers anymore, right? It's such a backward argument. Junior programmers have never been more valuable to you as a company than they are now. Why? Well, the brutal answer to that is because the return on investment is shorter, because they will be effective faster, because they understand the AI tools better than your seniors do, because they're growing up with them, right? So if you think of it just as a raw investment opportunity, hiring juniors is cheap. They will be effective faster, which means your return on investment is quicker. The argument that you don't need them is so short-sighted it beggars belief. Likewise, you still need your senior people because your senior people know what good code looks like. And will ask awkward questions about, well, have you actually looked at what this is doing, and have you thought about how this works, and so on and so on. I'm a little bit unsure, I have to say, about the strata in the middle. I think middle ranking programmers, I fear a little bit for that strata at the moment. But I absolutely don't think programming is going away. Yeah, the tools are changing. It's a bit like the Industrial Revolution, except for programming, right? We were a cottage industry, and suddenly we're more like a factory. But I don't think programming goes away. And I don't think programming stops being interesting either. If you found it interesting before, I think it's still interesting.
Yeah, I think there's two levels of, I don't know what words to use because I'm trying to pick these separate. I guess without trying to gatekeep or be derogatory of any, there are some people who view themselves as programmers and their job is to program a computer by light and code. There are some people that view themselves as software engineers, and I'm using these terms for lack of anything else, where they view it more holistically. So from my point of view, I viewed myself as a software engineer throughout all my career, and my role is to talk to somebody that is a customer and user, figure out what problem we're solving, and deliver a solution. The bit in the middle is the how, and it's perfectly fine for me to turn around to them and say, you don't need a computer, you can use a pen and paper for that. My job is to solve that solution. Now, given that I'm a software engineer, it's probably going to involve a computer and some software, but it didn't have to. Whereas I think there are another bunch of people, and it seems to have maybe increased more recently, who view that their job as a programmer was just to write the code and everything else was external. Maybe this has been made worse by the fact that some organizations have split out a product manager or product owner and they talk to the customer. And we've never really done agile properly in most places, or agile, to me, being extreme programming, where we bring the customer into the team. Now, I can count on two fingers how many teams I've worked with that have actually had the customer in the team. And neither of them was actually doing extreme programming, ironically. So I think that separation is probably part of the problem as well. So the people that view and tie their identity to programming, and maybe they're the kind of people that describe themselves as, I'm a Java programmer, I'm a JavaScript programmer, I'm a Python programmer, rather than saying I'm a software engineer and all that's just tools. So maybe I think that's perhaps some of the disparity that we see. I totally agree that junior developers are really valuable. I'm glad you added that you need the seniors for the taste element and the knowing what good looks like. There's a danger going too far and focusing just on junior developers because of return and missing that they still need that mentoring, that coaching, the guidance of people that have made the mistakes and try and share that knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Right back to where you started this with lighting. I don't think too often we do a good job of writing down what those mistakes are and sharing the knowledge. I so often see people now who have 5, 10, sometimes even 15 years of experience in this industry talking about things, and I'm thinking, well, we solved that 20, 25 years ago.
Oh, yes.
The classic example, I don't know if you can see off my shoulder, I've got the Mythical Man month and people wear, and so many things in that. Yes, the scenarios have changed, but the problems and the people issues are still exactly the same. And the answers are in those books, but a lot of people have forgotten them, never read them.
Even within technical things, like I've lost track of a number of times I've sat with people who are essentially reinventing Lamport clocks or something. And it's like, we solved this in the 1970s, right? It's like we're quite weird as a discipline. I think we're still quite immature as a discipline in terms of what we teach people. And as a result, we do constantly reinvent things that, reinvent things that we solve better in the past, like distributed tracing and those kind of things, as well as you say, how to structure teams and, the fact that if you organize teams in silos, they behave in siloed ways. And, stuff that seems really obvious, but we have to keep relearning it all the time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned AI for the rest of us. So let's jump to that and give context to people. What is AI for the rest of us? How can anyone find out about it? And
AI for the rest of us is one of my favorite things. So it's a bunch of different things. So it started as a series of meetups, which were started by the wonderful and inimitable Hannah Foxwell. So that's a series of meetups she runs in London. It's also, as I said, a conference, and the conference itself is a wonderful thing. This year it was held at the Museum of London, and we had, people like Redora lead at Google Cloud, and we had people like the Tony Blair Institute Senior Director of AI, and one of the co-authors of Team Topologies and the whole range. And it's now also a weekly newsletter, which Hannah and I co-write together. And writing it is genuinely, honestly, the highlight of my week. So the idea, it's very much as the name implies, the idea is to provide information on AI, not only for machine learning engineers and data scientists, but also for programmers and for anyone else who might be impacted, which I increasingly think is essentially everybody. I get to write it in my own voice, which is quite rare. So a lot of the time, if you're writing for a publication, you're kind of trying to write in their house style. So with the newsletter, I get to write as me, which is lovely. And Hannah and I have slightly different perspectives on AI, which I think makes it really interesting. So I'm a bit more of an old, cynicky boots, and Hannah is a bit more of an optimist. And so each week we try and round up in a jargon-free way what's happening and why it matters. So, for example, we might talk about, there was a report that did the rounds a while ago of 95% of corporate AI pilots reportedly failing. And, is that even the right way to think about it? And what does that even mean? Or what it means that ChatGPT now has 700 million weekly active users, which is, nearly 10% of the world's active population. We might look at reliability and security challenges, or the politics of the European AI and sovereignty, or why voice assistants still haven't quite cracked discovery, even though it feels like the most natural interface imaginable. So it's a real range of things. Hannah tends to bring a kind of practitioner perspective. She's very engaged with the agent and kind of agentic design space, and she thinks quite carefully about human and organizational dimensions, as we were just talking about. And I bring the sort of slightly skeptical journalistic eye. So, things like OpenAI's research on hallucinations, which I think is really interesting, but unconvincing, or, broader ethical questions. So copyright, environmental impact, whose values our chatbots actually reflect, embody. And obviously we both go out in the world. So Hannah does meetups and DevOps days and conferences. I also do quite a lot of conferences and speak quite a lot publicly, and we sort of bring back what we find. So the whole kind of ethos is very practical and accessible and resolutely free of hype, which I'm going to say in the current AI landscape is, should we say, more of a differentiator than maybe it should be.
So have you been following Hannah Fry's BBC series on AI?
I haven't watched it, but I do have it queued up on my iPlayer. So it is on my to watch list, but I haven't had the opportunity to see it yet.
It's an interesting. I'm only partway through the first episode, but it's an interesting look at.
Didn't it start like this week or something? I think I can be forgiven. I did see it was coming out, but I haven't
Yes,
haven't
I
watched
think
it
the
yet.
first one. Yeah, I never watch things live these days. They're all all recorded, so I don't actually know quite when it was live, but I think it was earlier this week.
Yes, yeah, I think it was. But yes, I've got it. I have got it queued up. I saw it was coming, and it's it's. I mean, Hannah Fry, not as Hannah Fry rather than Hannah Foxwell, obviously different people. But yes, I have got it queued up. I haven't had a chance to see it yet. But I think in general, this is a thing that, as I say, I think as an industry, we need more communicators desperately, because we are having an outsized impact on the world. And we're very bad at explaining what we're doing and why. And I also would argue we're incredibly bad at thinking through the consequences of our actions. And oddly enough, I think communicating better helps with both of those things. And we need to get better at it, because otherwise it will end badly.
Yes, well, that's very much what the documentary with Hannah Fry focused on for this week, looking at chatbots and the influence of Replica on a young man who then went on to try and assassinate the Queen.
Right. Yes. I did a couple of articles for the news stack around trust and safety and generative AI, and I went and talked to various psychologists and AI ethicists in various fields. And the more of those conversations I had, the more terrifying it got. It's one of those things where we really haven't thought this through, and this is very bad. I mean, there have been multiple cases of teenagers committing suicide as a result of, is stretching it, right? But people committing suicide having interacted with chatbots that encourage them to do so, right? That is an actual documented phenomenon. Now, cause and effect with something like suicide is extremely complex, because it is, and you can't just say it's because of AI. But there's no question that generative AI is causing, it causes psychosis in people. And design choices that we make when we build these systems cause that to be more likely or less likely. So
absolutely.
We are being, I would say, recklessly unethical about the way we're building these tools and putting them out. And some companies, I mean, Character AI is probably, for me, the most sort of possibly the worst offender. But I would argue that, like a lot of what OpenAI has done has also been reckless. There's no reason why your chatbot needs to pretend all the time that it's not a machine. That's a design choice. And if you sit in user sessions when people interact with these things and watch what that does to people, it's quite disturbing. I think having something that talks to us in a way that sounds human breaks a load of heuristics that we have. And so we form attachments to the machine that we wouldn't form with, say, a cat or a dog. But a cat or a dog is a way more intelligent than your AI is. It's just that the AI talks to you in a way that sounds human, and so you ascribe meaning to what is essentially meaningless communication.
Yeah, and the thing that really bothers me with all this is it's not new. Back in the 1960s, we had ELIZA, and we saw how what is such a trivial, simple program can instill that in people.
Yes.
You can build ELIZA in a few hundred lines of code. It's doing some very simple tricks, but people believed back then that they were talking to something that was intelligent and human, that cared about them. LLMs today are so much more powerful. They still have some of those tricks built into their training. So we haven't thought through the ethics and the complexities and the impact that's going to have. Maybe only on a tiny percent of people, but when, as you say, you've got close to 1 billion users, that tiny percent is a hell of a lot of people.
Yes, it's the sort of old ethics rubbish argument, isn't it? Like, if one person throws a bit of rubbish out of the car, it doesn't really matter. But if everyone does it, it's a real problem. And the problem that we have as an industry is that we are not, again, when I started, a big piece of software that I worked on might be used by 20 people in a company. Right now, even my trivial little website has tens of thousands of users, or tens of thousands of people that come to it, right? We're operating, and if you're Google or someone, you're operating at planetary scale. and therefore even quite small, even if it is, and I'm not sure that that's true, by the way, but even if it is a small number of people that are adversely affected, that's still something that we need to take very seriously. And I think that I just think we're very bad at that. I mean, like, we're very bad at the ethics. We're very bad at thinking through, is this okay? And the danger is, I think most of us who work in IT love computers and love IT, right? And are excited by what these tools can do. And we imagine that everyone else shares our excitement, but most people don't. And the real danger is that instead of people being excited, people are going to get angry, and you're into pitchforks at dawn scenarios. It doesn't end well. Or, best case scenario, somebody who doesn't know what a computer is starts regulating the industry, and suddenly it becomes just a joyless place to work. It's probably better than the pitchfork scenario, but it's still not great. Which again is why I keep banging this thing about we've got to be more ethical and better at communicating, because otherwise, it doesn't end well for us. I'm fairly certain it doesn't end well for us.
Okay, I agree. So let's bring that back to what we can actually do about that. How does a software engineer get better at communicating? I think there's a couple of obvious ways: is writing and blogging, and presenting at conferences. So let's tackle the blogging first.
Okay.
How do you think they should get started today? And is it still useful? Is that the best way to get started?
I think it's still incredibly useful. I think it's absolutely worth it. I think, there is obviously a proliferation of AI-generated content, and the noise of social media, kind of tells you, oh, it's not really worth writing anymore because an AI can do it all for you. And I just don't think that's true. I think that authentic technical writing from practitioners is genuinely valuable, and in fact, I would say it's, if anything, more valuable than it was in the past. So I think it's worth it for that reason. I also think it's really good for your career. At least it is if you can do it well, and that's largely down to the fact that we mostly are, we work remotely, or in hybrid settings a lot of the time. So the ability to communicate clearly in written form becomes more essential than ever, because that's how so much of your communication happens. Writing is also a good way to build your personal brand and, all of that stuff. And it also forces you to learn and develop, because writing is a learning tool in a sense. I mean, thinking and writing are probably two different processes in the brain, but explaining something to someone else really tests how well you understand it. And that's why often experts are terrible teachers. It's because everything seems really obvious to them, right? So writing forces you to kind of fill in the gaps and gives you a concrete deliverable output, which is a wonderful reason for doing it, I think. So in terms of how to do it, there's a question that rises hate, and the question is, where do you get your ideas from? I don't know. I go down the idea shop and I buy them in packs of 6. I'm not really sure. I think for fiction, a lot of ideas actually come from confluence. Putting two things together that don't belong and going, what would happen if? So I don't know, like, everyone knows that if a werewolf bites you on a full moon, then you turn into a werewolf, right? Everyone knows that. What happens if a werewolf bites a chair on a full moon? Does the chair turn into a werewolf? And, you kind of imagine someone solving the mysterious case, and then right at the end, they sit on the chair, and, you see where we're going. That's confluence, right? For me, as a non-fiction writer, I think almost all of my ideas come from conversations I have with people and or lived experiences. And I think a good rule of thumb is, write about not necessarily what you know about, but what you care about. I think it's perfectly all right to treat writing as a research process, but I do think you need to care about the subject. I find it's really helpful to think about who I'm writing it for. So I like to have a definite person in mind before you start. I don't mean like an actual human. I mean like a construct, but what level is this person? What do they know? What do they not know? Because that allows you to answer questions like, well, how much do I need to explain? There are a few patterns. So journalism has a few patterns. The inverted pyramid is the most universal, which basically lead with the most important information and then work down into supporting detail. What you want in terms of your sentences is you want to think about each sentence as being like a hook that pulls the reader along. So the idea is, what you're trying to do is get someone to read to the bottom. You have to assume that at any point in time, someone's going to abandon. So what you want to do is you want to construct each sentence so the reader wants to read the next one. And the other trick is if you assume that no one gets to the bottom, whatever somebody leaves, you want them to come away with something useful. Does that make sense? So that's kind of what structure you're doing. There are some other, structures, things like the hourglass and the focus style and so on, depending a bit on what you're doing. Doesn't really matter for this. In terms of how to get started, well, spend a few minutes jotting down some titles on topics that you care about. And I would wager that if you actually sat down for 20 minutes and just brainstormed, you'd probably find you have more titles than you expected. And then pick the one that feels the most kind of alive to you. Decide who you're writing it for, set yourself a word budget, 1,500 words, something like that maybe, and then write a rough draft. And don't worry too much about how good your rough draft is. I don't let anyone see my first drafts ever. My first drafts are terrible. It's because I have a pathological fear of white bits of paper, which I developed reading English literature at university, where I had a lot of them. So my writing process, genuinely, is I just type. I just throw stuff at the screen until I know what I'm trying to do. And then I fix it afterwards. The way I would think about that as an engineer is it's exploring a problem domain by a method, in the same way that, if you're a test-driven developer, when writing tests is how you explore the problem domain before you write the code. Or if you're more UML-y, if anyone still does UML, people should still do UML. I'm not sure if anyone does. You explore the problem domain by drawing diagrams first, or whatever works. Doesn't really matter. Maybe you write a prototype and throw it away. But your first draft is that. It's exploring the problem domain. And then, the wonderful thing about writing on a computer is you can change anything afterwards. So you just refine it until it's good. Read it out loud. Always read it out loud, because you'll hear rhythmic problems and sentence construction problems that you won't pick up any other way. Assume you'll do about 2 or 3 drafts. It's one of those things you just get better by doing. It's literally just that. I only got good at writing because I did a lot of it. So it's good for your career. It helps sharpen your thinking. It's good for our industry as a whole. And also, when you get over your fear of it, the fear of writing that so many of us have, when you get over that, it's genuinely fun. And it's fun because it's hard. And as engineers, we like hard problems, right? So writing is another hard problem. A good sentence isn't an accident. A good sentence takes time to craft. And that's joyful when you get it right. Or when you get a really good analogy and you're just like, oh God, that totally works. It was actually a sponsor article, but I was trying to describe a phenomenon about how each time a new API standard gets adopted, we don't get rid of the old standard, we just add it on top. So you go into companies and they've got sort of 15 different API standards. And I came up with the idea of it being like sort of API sediment. And when I got that analogy, I was like, that totally works. I want that to be a thing now. And that kind of thing it's joyful. So, but you do need to get over that kind of fear of writing thing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's tackle the fear of writing first. I'm totally with you. I encourage people to just get out there and publish, because, we all think spotlight effect, it's called, that everyone's watching what we do, everyone's looking at what we do. But the reality is probably the first thing you publish, nobody will read. Maybe not the second or third thing. So just get out there and practice. It's one of those skills, like building software, that improves by you doing it. I totally agree. It's really satisfying, possibly because I also grew up wanting to be an author. It was high on my list of things to do and be a published author when I was a kid. I recognise a lot of the writing things you just talked about, because they're things that I came across when I started my first business in 2001. I was a software guy, so I went out and bought a whole bunch of books on copywriting, on marketing, and how to write press releases and do PR, back when people really focus on that for business. And then, of course, I always wanted to be a writer, so I studied it a lot. The interesting thing I find with that now is, because I've studied a lot and I've focused and learned how to write particularly effective social media posts, starting now to get increasingly people say this was written by an LLM, which gets really annoying. It's like, no, I've spent 25 years learning how to write effectively. An LLM has learned how to write moderately effectively by copying lots of effective writing. That's quite frustrating. Do you get that at all?
Yes, I do. I've certainly had. I don't think I've been accused of writing with an LLM particularly, but I've certainly had feedback on an article which is, your use of the M dash implies that this was written by a large language model. It's like, well, I do know what the key commands for an M dash are. You can go and look at my articles from 20 years ago and you'll find they feature because it's a useful form of punctuation. So that's an example of the kind of thing. It's interesting because I would say I can recognize a piece of large language generated text because it has a very distinctive smell in the sense of a code smell. And I'm pretty sure I can tell. I will also say editing large language generated text is one of the most joyless jobs in the whole world because I can't tell when it's lying, which means I have to fact check every sentence. Whereas with a human, I can normally tell. So I can normally spot when someone is going off a bit or might not be quite sure of their ground, and those are the bits you fact check. Whereas with a large language model, it's literally you have to sit there and mechanically fact check every sentence if you care about accuracy, which is tiresome. I mean, I don't use AI in my writing at all, with the exception that I'm actually dyslexic, which is weird, given what I do for a living. But because I'm dyslexic, I find that it's quite helpful for spotting typos in particularly emails, where I tend to write them in a hurry. So what I will quite often do, in a way that you would think spell checkers would have solved that problem, but they really didn't. In fact, spell checkers and autocorrect make it worse. So one of the things for me, if I'm in a hurry doing an email, I can stick it into Claude and say, are there any typos? And it's pretty good at spotting them. And that's helpful. But I don't use it for actual writing because I just find it doesn't help me. And I would, if you're trying to learn the craft of communicating, I would encourage you not to use a large language model.
Yeah.
I think as well, I've kind of said this already, but it maybe bears repeating. I do think there is less of a market for generic writing than there used to be. Like, I think no one's really interested in reading copy that could have been spat out by a large language model. But there's copy that you can write that isn't that a large language model can't write. So I think it might be a smaller market, if you like, but I do think there's a significant market for authentic writing from people who know what they're talking about that doesn't go away. And I think it's a bit of a phase as well. Like, everyone's sort of, that was written by a large language model because you've done a thing that I couldn't do, therefore you must have cheated. And I think that's a thing we'll probably go through.
Yeah, absolutely. We've covered the sense of satisfaction you get from writing. I think we've both explored that. Let's move then on to talk about conferences. What do you see as the benefit of presenting at conferences, and how should a software engineer go about starting at that?
Benefits. So there's a few. It depends a bit on the event. Again, just speaking is another form of communication. Getting good at it is helpful. You will, at some point in your career, be required to give a presentation. And if you don't know how to do that, it will be a horrible experience for you and the people watching you. And no one wants that. So I would encourage you to do it. I would say one of the single most powerful tools in my toolbox is my ability to stand up in a room and talk to people convincingly. The second half of my career is basically built around writing and speaking. And again, I wasn't born with it. I learned it. It's a craft. In terms of how does one speak at conferences, well, you probably don't start by speaking at a conference. You probably start, there's a natural ladder, and you can jump rungs, but on the whole, you probably don't want to, because it's likely to put you off if it goes badly, and it's kind of unnecessary anyway. So you probably begin with, like, if your company does lunch and learns or something like that, or tech days at work, start there. They're relatively low stakes. They're friendly audiences. They're people you already know. Local meetups can be like the next step on that ladder. And then regional conferences, and then eventually international conferences, and then invited conferences and keynotes, and I don't know, TED or something. Those things all come later, if at all, and that's perfectly fine. Like, there's enormous value at every level of the ladder. And I should say as well, even if you've got, I've done keynotes at invited conferences in wonderful places like Australia, but I still go and speak at meetups because I still find speaking at meetups a valuable thing to do. So it's not like you go up a ladder rung and never do the smaller thing. It would be like, being a band that only played Wembley Stadium or something. It's a silly thing to do. Go and play in a pub occasionally and remember why you'd love it. It's that kind of thing. So the practical first step, find a user group that covers topics you care about, go start attending, get a feel for the events, then reach out to the organisers, propose a talk. User groups are almost always looking for volunteers to speak. They're really wonderfully forgiving places on the whole as well to try out things. I quite often, if I've got a talk I'm not sure about, I could think this works, but I don't know it works, so I'll go and do it at a meetup, because if it doesn't work, I'll know, and it's not too bad, because maybe only 100 people saw it, which is quite livable with. And you get, there's feedback you can't get by standing in front of a mirror, however nice it would be to be able to just do it that way, right? I think it's worth thinking about what you want to be known for before you start as well. That might sound a bit grandiose. It doesn't need to be. It might just be, I don't know, I'm a Java developer, and therefore I'm going to go and speak at Java events because I want to be known as a Java developer. Well, that's fine. Okay, that's all you need, really. But having a sense of direction makes it easier to identify the conferences you want to target and you're willing to commit to, and which ones you don't want to do. I would also say it's worth thinking about how much time are you happy being away from friends and family, because that does have a cost, and it's worth being honest with yourself about your limits before you do, what I tend to do, and commit to everything that comes my way and then go, oh, hell, I'm actually away for the next 4 months. And in my case, like most of the time when I'm speaking, I'm not actually earning any money and I'm self-employed. So that's a trade-off too, for me personally, right? But also, I miss my wife and my kids when I'm not at home. What else? Getting accepted, you need to learn how to craft a CFP. Your title really matters. Most conference attendees won't read your abstract. Sad but true. Therefore, your title needs to tell them what they need to know. And the single most reliable indicator of whether a talk will succeed or not is, does it meet the expectations of the audience who came into it? And if your title doesn't give them the correct expectations, then you're really on a losing streak from the get-go. So the title does really matter. Unless you're brilliant at it, resist the temptation of trying to be too clever with a title. A good test, I think, is to ask yourself whether, without any other context, you would want to attend the talk and know what to expect. What else? Having material in the public domain, blog posts, articles, videos, whatever, gives reviewers something to assess, particularly if they don't recognize your name. And then, like with blogging, care about the topic. Right? You don't need to be the world's foremost expert, but you do need to be genuinely interested, because that comes through in your voice, I think, and your body language. And you can probably train yourself to pretend to be, I'm trying to remember, was it Frank Sinatra? Sincerity is everything. If you can fake that, you've got it made. But if you can't fake that, then actually caring really helps. Passion for a subject is contagious. And honestly, indifference is also contagious. So be passionate. And rehearse. Please rehearse. At least 3 times. Practice until you know the material well enough that you can ad lib. Because that gives you the confidence to recover when something goes wrong, and something will go wrong, I absolutely promise. Every single time I go on stage, something goes wrong. It's absolutely a guarantee. 3 run-throughs, I think, is the minimum. More is better. I've never felt over-rehearsed, personally. I know some experienced conference speakers feel that they get to a point where they're bored of the material and therefore boring. I've got to say that's never been my experience. I've done talks that I've done staff and never been bored of them. Oh, and one other trick, I present almost every talk to my wife the first time. That is infinitely more terrifying than standing on a stage in front of 1,500 people. Infinitely more terrifying. Not because my wife is a scary human, but there's something about being in a room with one person that's just properly scary. You feel vulnerable and you learn stuff that way. I do with the music, it's the same. If I play a piece of music that I'm working on to just one other human being whose opinion I actually care about, I hear it in a completely different way, and it reveals all the places where it's not working, or it's, oh God, those 8 bars are a bit dull or whatever. It's really revealing. So I always give it to my wife. If my wife isn't available, I'll give it to a cat. It doesn't really matter. But my wife is brilliant for that. And the other thing to remember is your audience wants you to succeed. They really do. Nobody sits down in a conference talk hoping to watch you struggle. They're there because your title caught their eye and they're curious about what you have to say. And that's a lovely starting point. It's not like doing stand-up in a club, right, where everyone wants you to fall on your face. Everyone wants you to do well.
Yeah, they came to listen, didn't they? They came to get the benefit. They want you to see you succeed and do that.
So that's lovely, right? It's just that feeling, keep that feeling in mind. You're going to be nervous. Everyone is nervous. If you're not nervous, I kind of worry for you. Like, I've done a lot of this. I'm still nervous before I go on stage. Actually, when I start normally, and then I riff into it fairly well now. But it takes time. If you're an experienced conference speaker and there's someone speaking at a conference, go and sit in the front row and smile and nod at them. It's so reassuring to see that. Look like you're enjoying yourself. It really helps. Laugh in the right places. Like if you've got a new speaker in the room, you as someone who's done a lot of speaking can help just by being present in a weird way. So that's another thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great set of advice. What have we missed, Charles?
Oh, gosh. So many things. If we were going to do a 3 lines for everything we talked about, writing, presenting, AI, etc., it's really, I think engineers need to communicate better and think more clearly and take responsibility for the world that our work creates. And I'm going to say, I don't think that we use this term soft skills a lot, which I hate, because I don't think that is a soft skill, right? I think that's your job, literally your job. And I would say that, someone once told me I didn't have a gift for words. In fact, I was told that a lot at school. As I said, I'm dyslexic. It's a thing I heard a lot. And I kind of have spent half of my career demonstrating that that's not true. Not for any particular, not for that reason really, but because, and certainly not because of talent. It's just practice. It's just practice. That's all it is. And pretty much everything I've talked about, I think, works that way. You don't need a gift. You just need to kind of crack on with it, really, I think.
I think that's the secret to life, isn't it? So many people think you've got to be born with a natural talent, where actually, if you practice most things, you can get into the top 10%. Sure, the top 0.1% may be especially gifted, but you can normally make the top 10% by practice and hard work.
Yeah, and I would yes and on that and say, yeah, and with everything, I think so much of life, as someone in his 50s who's had a certain amount of experience, I think so much of life is trying things and seeing what happens and not going, well, what if it doesn't work? What if, we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas isn't a great life strategy, I've discovered. Take a lot of shots on goal. Not all of them will land. It's fine. Some of them will. And I had no career plan. I had no idea what my career would look like. I didn't even plan on being a programmer. Like I say, I studied English at university. I only started programming because I started in publishing and I didn't like it. And then this publishing company had a bunch of problems that I could solve with software, and I knew how to write software, so I wrote software and ended up as a programmer. I kind of backed into it accidentally. I've never had a plan. I've just tried things and gone, oh, that's interesting. I shall do more of that. And I just think, in general in life, try not to be too scared of what's going to happen. Are people going to laugh? Are people going to point? Am I going to fall over? It doesn't matter. What matters is you gave it a go. And if, as you say, most of the time when you start, no one notices anyway. And even if they do, most people are pretty decent. It'll be fine.
Yeah. Yeah, if people laugh and point and ridicule, it's more a reflection of them and their insecurities than it is of you. So,
well, also, move on, you've done something that someone's noticed.
Yeah, that's true. But back to your shots on goal. If you don't kick the ball, you're guaranteed not to get a goal. If you kick the ball, you might get a goal, you might not. So better to try and fail. Awesome. I think that's a great place to wrap it up, Charles. If anyone wants to follow up, how can they get in touch with you?
So I'm Charles Humble on a lot of things. I'm on LinkedIn as Charles Humble. I'm on Blue Sky as Charles Humble. I think those are the 2 social things that I'm most active on. My own company has a silly name. It's Connaissance. It sounded like a good idea 30 years ago because you could Google it when I set the company up. It's very hard to spell and pronounce. But if you put Charles Humble Connaissance, CONISSAUNCE, into Google, it'll probably find me. And there's email and stuff if you prefer that. I'm regularly at conferences. Can I plug the newsletter? Subscribe to the AI for the Rest of Us newsletter. It's ace, and I'm not saying that because I co-write it. It's mostly Hannah Foxwell, but it's well worth a subscribe if you're interested in this kind of thing. And I'm always happy to hear from people. I'm always happy to have a conversation. Just reach out.
Awesome. And we'll put all those links in the show notes to save people trying to spell it. Thank you very much, Charles. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it. It's been lovely. Really appreciate your time.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Coding Chats. If you did, please like and subscribe. And feel free to check out these other videos on a similar topic.